Hey guys, this is going to be the last installment of our evolution series. This is going to go over the origin of life, and once we're done with this, we are done with evolution. So expect a test. Here we go. How did life start? This is what this PowerPoint, well, these notes I guess, are all about. Excuse me. So, when we look at the modern day universe, and we do some of the estimates that we are able to do, we figured out that life started anywhere, or I should say the universe started anywhere, between 13 to 15 billion years ago. And the theory goes that it happened in a single instant. So all the existing energy pretty much exploded, all from a single point, and created matter and antimatter all at the same time. This theory is known as the Big Bang Theory, so if you're familiar with the show, go Sheldon. So we now have all this matter. Now what? Well, it's estimated that the sun formed about 5 billion years ago. And then after the sun formed, the planets formed. And the planets formed as from a combination of tons and tons of space dust and asteroids, pretty much like big, large rocks floating around in space. A series of collisions caused these rocks and this dust to get closer and closer to each other, which increased their gravitational pull on each other, eventually forming the planets that we know as part of our universe. Earth is estimated to have formed about 4.6 billion years ago. But even after Earth was formed, it was constantly being hit and bombarded by meteorites. So the result was an atmosphere that was very reducing in nature early on. A bunch of water vapor, some carbon dioxide, some gaseous hydrogen and nitrogen, but we had almost no oxygen whatsoever. The little bit of oxygen that we did have wasn't necessarily exposed into the atmosphere, it was trapped. And how do we know this? Well, we look at the rocks. When iron reacts with oxygen, it produces rust. There are definitely signs of iron in some of the oldest rocks on Earth, but that iron shows no sign of oxidation, no rusting, which means no free oxygen was available for rusting. If you look at more modern rocks or more recent rocks, you can definitely see some oxidation and some rusting taking place in the iron banding patterns. If you look at this picture right here, see where it gets all kind of grayish? Okay, so the gray parts would be the actual rock. Sorry, the red parts are the actual rock, and the gray parts are where we have iron deposits, and those are all from space. So how do we come up with the time estimates? It's through radioisotope dating. Carbon dating is the term that we normally use. Radioactive isotopes, hopefully you remember this from chemistry, have what we call half-lives, where it takes a very specific amount of time for half of that element to have decomposed. So we can check the rocks for the presence of certain radioactive isotopes. The ones that we tend to use are carbon, either carbon-14 or carbon-12. And we can see at what point in their decay they're at, and then calculate based off of that. All living things have the same ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12. And the carbon-14 doesn't actually start to decay until the organism has died. So that's the basis that we use for dating, like fossils, for example. So what are the conditions like on early Earth? We kind of touched on this a little bit, but let's go a little bit more into depth. So there was definitely water vapor. So there's water on Earth, but it's all gaseous for this, right now. There's carbon dioxide, there's nitrogen, excuse me, nitrous oxide in varying quantities, hydrogen, ammonia, methane, and hydrogen sulfide. So we have a lot of hydrogen available and lots of electrons available because of the presence of hydrogen. Notice again, no free oxygen, sorry. Any oxygen we have is tied up in compounds, and a lot of it is trapped in rock formations. In terms of an energy source, even though there is the sun, so we do have some UV radiation, we also got a ton of energy in the form of lightning and some energy in the form of volcanoes. So oxygen is highly corrosive. As it oxidizes, it pretty much breaks molecules apart. If oxygen was present in our early atmosphere, be aware that life as we know it would not exist, because that oxygen would erode all of our molecules away. So it's actually a good thing that early on there was no oxygen in Earth. So you're probably wondering, okay, we know where the rock came from. That's all of the meteors hitting each other and bombarding each other and getting pulled in because of gravity, but it's also due to a ton of volcanic activity. We have lots and lots of eruptions, we have lots of magma flowing around the Earth, and the Earth is spinning, and eventually this magma is cooling, which produces rock. It produces the Earth that we know. Where did the water come from? Most of it came from, believe it or not, meteorites. A lot of meteorites have ice particles, and they also have steam particles. It's hard to think of steam in terms of particles, but it's there. And as they hit the Earth, they deposited those particles on our surface. And then through a combination of some other things, eventually we had water. Okay, so you don't have a picture here, so hold on a second real quick while I get you a picture. Okay, so now that you have an image we can work with. So now comes the question. We have a whole bunch of abiotic features, and abiotic particles and molecules. We don't have any biotic molecules and features. So where did life come from? Well, the going theory is called abiotic synthesis, and it pretty much says that organic life arose from the inorganic situation that we had going on in early Earth. So in 1920, two scientists tested this out. Their names are not important, so I'm not going to bore you with that. But this is kind of what they came up with. They came up with this apparatus to mimic the conditions that Earth was going through in its very early stages. So right here we have one set of glassware that's going to mimic an ocean. And then over here we have another set of glassware that's going to mimic the atmosphere. Attached to the glassware mimicking the atmosphere, they had electrodes. That's what these curly wires right here are for. And those electrodes could spark together, giving some energy. That energy was supposed to simulate lightning in the actual scenario with Earth. And then all of these tubes are just a series of coolings and condensings where water can be formed. Excuse me. So pretty much what they found when they did test this hypothesis, which was done in 1953, is that from some of these inorganic molecules, this one's organic because it has carbon, this is nitrogen, hydrogen, and methane, they were able to produce amino acids and adenine. Initially, one of the professors who tested this out stated that they had made up to 10 different types of amino acids. Well, we now know that at the time they did not have the technology available to really tell them how many they made. In truth and in fact, they made more than 10. So that's the theory of how organic molecules got into this inorganic world that we are making. Okay, so now that we have organic molecules, we can start talking about actually making life. And the first things that we're going to form, we're going to be lipid molecules. So phospholipids, to be precise. Phospholipids have the amazing ability of part of the molecule being hydrophobic and the other part being hydrophilic. The head is hydrophilic, which means that it likes water, and the tail is hydrophobic, which means that it doesn't like water. So phospholipids always arrange themselves so that their tails are on the inside and their heads are on the outside. Well, this creates kind of like a balloon or a droplet effect. So if you look at it, this looks very similar to a cell membrane. And that's the theory, that these lipid bubbles appeared, and they did a couple of things. They separated the outside environment from the inside environment, and they created a space where metabolism and reproduction can take place. These early bubbles or droplets were called liposomes, and they could actually reproduce by incorporating more lipids into their current structure or pinching themselves off and making smaller and smaller molecules. So literally this molecule could put more little lipids in and become bigger, and then divide itself and become two smaller liposomes. So That's kind of like our very initial, our very first, very basic type of reproduction. Over time, it is felt that some of these liposomes could start to do actual reproduction and perform very simple metabolic reactions. So they could use glucose a little bit, they could use starch, they could turn those molecules and substances into other things. So the very first aspect of metabolism is developing at this point. This is called protocell synthesis. So we're not a true cell yet, we're like the precursor almost to a cell. Then cells that comprise of a lipid membrane started getting genomes of DNA. That DNA got transcribed into RNA, and ribosomes could then translate the RNA into proteins. The lipid membrane would just keep adding more individual phospholipids into itself and then pinch off and become smaller protocells. So not only do we have reproduction, we also have metabolism. Now we're starting to talk about some genetics. Now, it is believed that the first genetic material was RNA. We started off as an RNA world. And here's why. There are a couple of reasons. RNA is self-replicating. It replicates itself. It doesn't need any extra machinery, no enzymes, or a whole bunch of things, parts and pieces. And just like enzymes, RNA has some catalytic properties. It's like a natural catalyst. It speeds up certain reactions or causes certain things to happen. A ribozyme is an RNA molecule that can be catalytic. So a piece of RNA that behaves like an enzyme is pretty much what a ribozyme is. The only difference between ribozymes and actual enzymes is ribozymes are self-cleaving. So once they've done their part, they're consumed by their reactions. With true enzymes, with true biological catalysts, we know that they can speed up a reaction but remain unchanged themselves. So we start off as RNA, and there's a lot of evidence for that, the whole self-replicating thing, and the fact that RNA can be catalytic. So far we have no DNA, we have no proteins, none of that. All we have is RNA. So, when did life actually begin? Well, the Earth formed, like I told you, about 4.6 billion years ago. I also told you the environment was really, really hostile. Very hot, no oxygen, very reducing, not a whole lot of water, and the water itself was hot. Just not a pleasant place to live. The Earth didn't become adaptable to life until about 3.9 billion years ago. And we know this because the earliest fossils that we have found for actual life dates back to about 3.5 billion years ago. Now, life has to start somewhere. And if you think about it, our simplest forms of lives are cells, prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Well, we know prokaryotes are simple, no true nucleus, no real membrane-bound organelles. So the going theory is that they came first. So we kind of have a small problem. We're getting bigger and bigger cells. Those lipid molecules are becoming bigger and bigger. They can do more processing, more metabolism, more reproduction, and all that kinds of stuff. But now we have this genetic issue that we have to take care of. We have, not DNA, but we have genetic material in the form of RNA. But the genome is getting larger. We're constantly adding to the genome because life itself is changing. It's adapting. Excuse me. So it becomes a situation where DNA is better than RNA for a few reasons. First of all, it's more stable. It's not as prone to mutations as RNA is. Okay? It's a bigger molecule, a more complex molecule. So it protects our genetic information a whole lot better. Excuse me. So let's talk about what those first cells would look like. They're definitely going to be prokaryotic. They're also going to be anaerobic, which means, as you should know, without oxygen. There's no oxygen in this atmosphere, so it doesn't make sense that the first life would be able to breathe oxygen because there is none there. They came from a common ancestor, and then about 3.5 billion years ago, The prokaryotes themselves evolved into two different groups, bacteria and archaea. So now we have actual life. Now what? Well, we're going to have to start stepping along on some of the things that we're able to do. That life has to be able to be useful and productive. So the first big change is that we're going to start to be able to do photosynthesis. Note that if the first photosynthesis didn't actually produce oxygen, okay, that again was about 3.5 billion years ago. About 3 billion years ago, modern-day photosynthesis started taking place in cells that resemble what we now know as cyanobacteria. And they evolved pretty much to produce oxygen. And this is where our first oxygen kind of came from. We're starting to convert that very reducing atmosphere into an oxidizing atmosphere. Because of the presence of oxygen now in Earth or on Earth, we're going to have a whole lot of changes taking place. Oh, these are cool, and I have actual rocks of these that I will show you. They're not actual rocks, they're little organisms called stromatolites, and they secreted minerals, they also made oxygen, so they're pretty much our very first living things. I know they don't look like much, but first living things. True living things. True organisms. So, we have this oxygen. You'd think that that's always a good thing. Not necessarily, and we'll see how too much oxygen could be bad later on. But we know that oxygen started being made about 2.7 billion years ago. Well, it means that now that we have oxygen, now that we've thrown in a different molecule into our original mix, life is no longer going to arise from non-living materials. Because again, oxygen is oxidizing. It breaks those initial compounds down. Organisms that can tolerate oxygen are now at an advantage. So for the first time you have, oh, I can breathe oxygen. Oh, I can't breathe oxygen. And now that there's more oxygen in the atmosphere, organisms that can actually utilize oxygen are going to be selected for. So natural selection is starting to take place. Obligate anaerobes, which are organisms that cannot breathe any oxygen whatsoever, they're going to start becoming extinct. Okay? And if they're not becoming extinct, they're definitely changing their niche. They're only going to be found in places without oxygen, environments that don't have oxygen. Some of the excess oxygen went on and formed our ozone layer, and that helped and still helps to filter out the UV radiations, just like some of our oceans do. So we know that organisms that could tolerate oxygen are going to survive. The ones that can't kind of die out. The next major thing that's going to happen is we're going to be able to do aerobic respiration. So we're talking ATP. We can actually make, usable energy. Okay? So aerobic respiration is way more efficient at making ATP, the energy molecule, than anaerobic respiration, which is what everybody was doing before oxygen was around. So let's recap what we know. We know we have actual life, and we know that most of that actual life can utilize oxygen because that's how the atmosphere is changing. We now have oxygen present. We also know that photosynthesis is taking place, and we also know that we've moved from anaerobic respiration to aerobic respiration. So hopefully your brains are working, and you're thinking, if we can do photosynthesis, that means we must have chloroplasts of some sort. And if we can do respiration, that means we must have mitochondria of some sort. Now notice we haven't talked about eukaryotic cells yet. So that means that those chloroplasts and those mitochondria are actually prokaryotes. They're some of those initial prokaryotic cells, because we have not talked about eukaryotes yet, but we're about to. The evolution of eukaryotic cells took place in two steps. Compartmentalizing, sorry, that's hard to say, and something else called endosymbiosis. So we're going to step through that. So we know we have these liposomes that can just add some phospholipids and make their membranes bigger and bigger and bigger. At some point, we're going to have more membrane than we need. So some of that extra membrane started folding inward, and they created some of our initial membrane-bound organelles. Things like, I'm going to write this for you, our ER and our lysosomes and our nucleus. Okay, so this infolding gave rise to some of those very common placed organelles that we're so familiar with. What are the advantages of having organelles? Well, you can specialize. You can compartmentalize certain chemical pathways or metabolic pathways, and they all do the same thing and are in the same area. So you're becoming way more efficient. We don't have to diffuse all the way through the cell to do certain things anymore. We're only going to certain organelles for that. Excuse me. So as these eukaryotes are evolving, two separate events happen that result in gaining some additional organelles. Organelles that have abilities that some of our membrane-formed organelles didn't. So we develop a symbiotic relationship between an ancestral aerobic heterotrophic bacterial prokaryote, I know, a mouthful, and a eukaryotic cell. So pretty much what we're saying is something that looked and behaved like a mitochondria got swallowed up by one of these bigger liposomes that now has some organelles in it, and realized, hey, this is not a cool place to live. I think I'll hang out here and do my thing, and my thing happens to be making energy. Okay, so this energy-producing prokaryote is what will eventually become the mitochondrion. Note it's not a mitochondrion yet, but it's on its way to being a mitochondrion. Now, hopefully you learned this freshman year. Mitochondria have their own DNA. So that's another thing that tells us that they were once prokaryotic. They were able to survive on their own because they had their own genetic material. Some of the genes in that DNA did relocate to the nucleus, but some genes stayed. And that's why to this day, every person has mitochondrial DNA, and they get that from their mothers. Okay, so that's one thing. So now we have cells that are more efficient at creating energy. But what about the other relationship? Well, it's like I like to say, it's the same song, it's different verse. So now we have a symbiotic relationship that's going to develop between an ancestral autotrophic bacterial prokaryote. Again, we're not talking about archaea, and a eukaryotic cell. So something that kind of looks like and kind of behaves like a chloroplast is going to end up inside one of these liposomes, again, that has membrane organelles and maybe even some mitochondria-esque bacteria, or prokaryotes, sorry. And it's going to realize this is not a bad place to hang out. I'm going to stay here and do what I do. This autotrophic prokaryote eventually is going to become the chloroplast. Strangely enough, just like the mitochondria, chloroplasts have their own DNA. So again, that supports the theory that they were once prokaryotic. Some of those genes are going to move into the nucleus, but quite a few of those genes remain in the chloroplast. It's important that you know, and that's why I'm going to kind of like box it for you, that the second endosymbiotic event happened after the first, obviously. So in other words, the mitochondria formed a symbiotic relationship with our primitive cell first, and then the chloroplast formed a relationship with our primitive cell. And how do we know this? Well, think about it. Animal cells all have mitochondria. Plant cells all have mitochondria. But only plant and autotrophic cells have chloroplast as well. Okay, so what is the evidence that exists that supports endosymbiosis? Well, let's compare our mitochondria and our chloroplast a little bit. First thing is, they look very similar to each other. And when we get to that section in biology, you'll realize exactly what I'm saying. But internally, their membranes and their internal structures are very, very similar. They have their own DNA. However, their DNA is much more similar to bacterial DNA than it is to modern-day nuclear DNA. So that tells that there's a relationship on that side. They carry out protein synthesis. They make their proteins the exact same way that bacterial cells make their proteins. They have their own ribosomes, but their ribosomes resemble bacterial ribosomes more than they do modern day eukaryotic ribosomes. I spelled which wrong and my phone is ringing. Hold on. All right, so again, that's the evidence that supports endosymbiosis. So you learned that we use cladograms or phylogenetic trees to show evolutionary relationships. But when it comes to our three major domains, a tree doesn't really work. So instead we use what we call the ring of life. Now eukaryotic cells have genes in common with an ancestral cell. This ancestral cell gave rise to archaea and eukarya. But it also has bacterial genes too, due to endosymbiosis, taking in those mitochondria, taking in those chloroplasts, or at least the early forms of them. So instead of using a tree, we just use this ring, call it the ring of life. Okay, this is a graphic that shows again the evolution of single-celled eukaryotes. This will be available for you in class when you get here. Okay, so now let's talk about sexual reproduction, because we're living, we can do a whole bunch of complex things, like we have DNA, we can metabolize and all this stuff, but we can't create variety. We have no real true sexual reproduction yet. We kind of just have binary fission up until this point. So that's our next milestone, being able to sexually reproduce in eukaryotic cells. There is evidence that suggests the very first organisms to do this were red algae, and that's what they look like here, and this here and here are fossilized versions of the same organism. So they were the first species, the oldest species known to reproduce sexually. As a result, we're going to create some variability, we're going to create some differences because we're exchanging DNA material, and this allows evolution to occur more rapidly because we have a whole bunch of different traits that natural selection can select for or against. Note that most eukaryotes at this stage are single-celled eukaryotes, and we call those protists, and we don't really have multicellular organisms yet. So we have single-celled eukaryotes that are capable of metabolism. They have these endosymbiotic relationships, and they can do sexual reproduction. Our next step is to create multicellular eukaryotes. The oldest known species would be algae, and they appeared about 1.2 billion years ago. By about 900 million years ago, so now note we're in the millions and not the billions anymore, we have representatives of all major eukaryotic branches, except for plants. Now, our really big and really diverse multicellular organisms don't really appear until about 565 million years ago. What you have to remember is that there wasn't a whole lot of land to go about. All of this life that we've talked about up until this point is happening in the ocean. Most of the land was covered up by ice. Some people term that the snowball Earth, but there was very little land available. Excuse me. So, before we could populate the land, we had to have land to populate. So the Earth's crust, as you know, are divided into several plates, just sections, and they're constantly moving. Now the plates aren't very thick, and they sit on a layer or a sea, pretty much, of molten magma. So that's why they're always sliding and rubbing against each other, or one's going under or over the other. So over the course of time, our continents, as we know them, have not necessarily always looked the way they do now. They've always shifted and changed. At one point they were all together, and they were called Pangaea. Then they separated into two bigger supercontinents, Laurasia and Gondwanaland. At other times they've been kind of in the same position that they are now, but they're constantly moving. Every time those plates move, they're going to create changes in our climate, in our ocean currents, and whether we can form glaciers or not, and a whole bunch of other geological phenomenon. These changes happen slowly, but they can result in really positive things, but they can also result in some of those mass extinctions that we talked about. Remember the 5 that I told you needed to know? Yeah, that's what I'm referring to. The only mass extinction I'm going to discuss today is the Cretaceous mass extinction, just because it's my favorite. It's the one that happened 65 million years ago. It's the one that killed out all of the dinosaurs, or most of the dinosaurs except for raptors, which gave rise to birds. 50% of all of our marine species went extinct, and a lot of families of terrestrial animals also went extinct. Remember I told you, if you weren't about 10 pounds big, then you didn't have a whole lot of hope of surviving. This extinction was caused by a meteorite that collided with the Earth in what is now present-day Mexico, the Yucatan Peninsula. It caused a crater of about 100 miles big, really, really large. It caused huge tsunamis. It caused a lot of debris to be blown up and dust to block out the sun. It caused the changing of some of the compounds and the gases that were trapped in the soil being exposed into our atmosphere. It also increased temperatures on Earth by several hundred degrees, ignited massive fires, and then there was a ton of volcanic activity happening as well. So a whole lot of bad. Now, when photosynthesis, began about 2.4 billion years ago, oxygen was just really being produced as a byproduct. It was just a result. Oh, hey, look, we make oxygen. Great. No one was actually trying to make oxygen. So for the first billion years or so, oxygen levels were fairly low because all of the oxygen available was too busy reacting with minerals like iron. Remember I told you oxygen is very oxidizing. It tends to break things down. So initially, even though we were making oxygen, there was none available for use. After a while, we started to see increases in our oxygen levels. That led to a mass extinction. Remember those obligate anaerobes, the ones that could only exist in an anaerobic situation? All of them died out because they could not tolerate oxygen at all. The maximum that our oxygen levels have ever gotten to is about 250 million years ago. Okay, then we got to the point where we could start having plants. Most of the large plants that we currently have, or even had then, lived in low, swampy kinds of areas. As those plants died, they got buried in the swamp. Well, because they're all buried, they almost fossilized in a way. They didn't actually decompose. And they became the deposits of coal that we now pretty much depend on to live. When those swamplands dried up, the oxygen production decreased to levels even lower than today because swamplands produce lots of vegetation. Lots of vegetation do lots of photosynthesis. Lots of photosynthesis produces lots of oxygen. You get rid of them, you get rid of the oxygen levels. All right, that is pretty much it. Again, if I went too fast, I'm sorry. I'm trying to keep these short, or as short as possible. Feel free to rewind, pause, all that stuff. Bring your questions to class. We'll talk about it. See you later.